Today's topic is how financial services can mitigate Phygital attacks against critical infrastructure. Joining us to discuss this topic is our panel of experts. First, Thomas Geppert. Thomas has over 30 years of experience in global corporate security. He's the former head of corporate security for Deutsche Börse, where he led physical security and executive protection. Thomas is now the CEO of PIC Security Solutions, where he provides security strategy to a range of clients. Thomas, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
Next, we have Cody Martin. Cody is the director of mail security for RaySecur. Cody was previously an agent with the U.S. Postal Inspection Service for 12 years, where he served on the Dangerous Mail Investigations Unit. Cody now heads up RaySecur's SOP team. Cody, thank you for joining us.
Thanks, TJ.
And lastly, Fred Burton. Fred is one of the world's foremost authorities on protective intelligence, security, and counterterrorism. Fred is executive director of the ONTIC Center for Protective Intelligence. And previous to ONTIC, Fred was the chief security officer for Stratfor, a leading geopolitical intelligence platform. He was also previously U.S. Secret Service, law enforcement in Maryland, and a special agent with the U.S. Diplomatic Security Service, where he became deputy chief of the Counterterrorism Division. Fred, thank you for joining us, and that is an impressive resume.
Oh, you're too kind. Thank you for having me, TJ.
So before we dive in, gentlemen, I just want to remind our audience that we will, as Raquel said, have a Q&A section at the end. As questions come up, please do throw those into the box, and we will read those aloud and have our panel answer those questions when we come to the end. So without further ado, what I'd like to do is bring in Fred. Fred, can you set the stage for us a little bit? Take us through some statistics, these quick stats here that folks can know about our topic today.
For sure, TJ. Well, first, I would like to thank ASIS and RaySecur for the opportunity for ONTIC to be here today. We really appreciate the opportunity to share some of our recent data. The interesting part about this is at the Center for Protective Intelligence, this is our third research survey, and we're in the process of conducting survey number 4. And one of the things that, as you go through some of these data points to take away, is that we surveyed 359 physical security, CSOs, legal, chief compliance officers, chief risk officers, to try to get a good holistic view of the landscape of what we're all confronted with today. And some of the unique kind of things that really I find fascinating as you look at some of these data points is the aspect of how many are actually originating in the cyberspace. Now, for those of us that are practitioners, we get that, right? You're going to have that threat that's either data mined from either a social media post or perhaps something from the dark web. But it really argues, as you look through some of our survey results, which I would encourage everyone to try to get their hands on because the data has really been helpful to a lot of Fortune 1000s, is that as you start trying to triangulate down into some of the data points, you see that real need for the convergence between cyber and physical as well. And then as you look on the slide data point on the right, and you start thinking about this, let me bring a stat that's not reflected on the slide, but 83% of our respondents said that unmanaged physical threats are increasing corporate risk and are having a financial effect, and some said even a catastrophic effect on ongoing business continuity, which is really very interesting when you look at it from a financial perspective. So for those of you that are doing any kind of living threat assessments and so forth, we can overwhelm you with data points at times with our surveys, but I encourage you to get your hand on that. Now, as you delve down into, as I try to recap our study, this is really interesting to me, just being an old executive protection kind of person. What really struck me as odd as we were researching this, and this has been consistent across all 3 of our surveys to the point that I really want to drill down, is to look at point number 1. And what I would like to call your attention to is the family have received threats. Now, hold that thought for a second. At the center, we're always talking to chief security officers. And as I kind of just benchmark with them, I have yet to really get a lot of hard examples of this. So I think what's happening as you look down into point number 4, companies are receiving those kinds of executive kidnapping threats. They're just not letting it well known, and probably rightfully so, just due to the internal blowback to that, not only from the C-suite, but chief legal counsel kind of perspective, but also the ramifications for the board and for any kind of publicly held company, the shareholder value. But as you look at this from a financial perspective, what is that cost, right? Meaning, how much is it costing to protect your executives? But what our surveys are saying is that in many ways, it's money well spent. And then as you look also into some of the other physical security challenges for CSOs, obviously supply chain disruptions. Look, what's taking place with Russia and Ukraine, the saber rattling in the South China Sea, desire for business continuity operations or other kinds of ability to kind of step up production elsewhere is really creating financial burdens across the entire spectrum. And then look at something as simple as building and property vandalism and the cost of that, which is really kind of interesting too, as we are coming, we think, a little bit out of COVID, although we have these resurgence that we're seeing all around the globe. And of course, for those of you that are in with operations here in the United States, look at number 10. I mean, there's no shortage of that when it comes down to just the living examples that we're seeing, not only in Uvalde, but Boulder and Buffalo, and the list just keeps growing and growing and growing. Now, I always ask this question whenever we were conducting some of our roundtables that we've had throughout the year. You know, what really does keep you up at night if you're a chief security officer? Because I know that that's the kind of problem that most of us think about, meaning there's only so much that you can control at times, especially in the geopolitical space. And living through what we're living through today with just this constant drumback of just negative news and the angst that's caused by just not only the work from home ramifications, but the return of the workforce back into the offices. And as you look at some of these aspects that you can take as physical examples of what really keeps chief security officers up at night, I think this is a good list. And the vaccination requirements is really kind of an interesting one, because we first started our surveys right when the pandemic hit. And you started looking at, you could kind of game board out what's going to happen as you look maybe 18 months down the road. And what you saw with like some of our surveys, and it really is kind of an uptick in progression across the all three, is that it's really creating problems in the workplace, meaning social, racial justice issues, the political dynamics with such a diverse workforce here in the United States, with depending upon who you believe in, you creates a lot of problems that are being dragged into the workplace, which is just kind of uptick the threat landscape. And although I don't have a stat to reflect this, one of the numbers that really jump out at me is that literally we saw a 50% increase in threats in the workplace between our last survey and our current survey. It went up from like 38% to 66%. And one of the other data points that I think that all of us really need to set back and reflect upon is that 27% of chief security officers, legal officers, compliance officers are really worried about activist whistleblowers in the workplace. And you start looking at that financial impact to that once something like that becomes public, and or the board is starting to ask questions about what is the ramifications, what systems do you have in place for insider threat identification, and how are you going about staying on top of that so none of us are blindsided by having an activist whistleblower go public. So as you look at this and reflect upon the very dreadful state of play here, especially in the United States with inflation, the rising costs of fuel, the challenges that workers have just going back into the workplace, the war in Ukraine, it's really a very dynamic time period, and it's the kind of variable that we're in from a threat landscape that it really requires almost constant monitoring to stay on top of as we start to just look at the world and hopefully try to figure out what it is that we can't control and what can we get in front of. And at the end of the day, how can we save companies money? So at this point, I'll toss it back to you, TJ, to move on.
Yeah, thank you, Fred. There's obviously quite a bit of information in there, and I know that several questions have come to mind from me, as I assume that must have also happened for the audience. So again, please throw those questions into the Q&A box. So Fred, we'll go back and kind of elaborate on a few of the points you've brought in. But what I'd like to do now is kind of highlight a few of the examples that that do exemplify what you're talking about. It's clear that mail threats can cause disruptions and harm, and this should not be too much of a surprise, I think, for many of the audience members today. But what we see is, as Raquel mentioned, RaySecur tracks mail security statistics. All we do and all we think about is the mail, and so we wanted to highlight a few of those points that might have gone, either under the radar or unnoticed by some security professionals. But it's, again, no surprise that in financial services and insurance, that there's a target on the back of these organizations. So there's a lot of different avenues, a lot of methods that can be at risk, especially through things like inbound mail, right? Stocks and interoffice communications. We know of one extreme example of interoffice mail being used to traffic narcotics across the United States. And that was obviously a significant threat to their legal status. And, you just don't want a member of your organization abusing your interoffice mail that way. And so there are a lot of examples where, things like this might happen. And in some cases, these incidents will make the news, right? We can track a few statistics where there were white powder threats just this year, just in the last few months. These names are obviously going to ring bells for a lot of folks on today's call. And these are the ones that we know about. These are ones that made it to a police scanner somewhere, a news blotter somewhere, and now there's a news article about it, and your brand is being kind of dragged through on that one. And so these are white powder threats. The scary thing in these examples is that this is 50 cents for a stamp and $1 or $2 for some flour, maybe a little bit of onion powder or wasabi powder. So whoever opens that envelope will get a reaction, and their heart rate goes up. This perceived severity of that incident goes up. Now that person is going to be isolated by first responders. They're going to be sort of quarantined and sitting there panicking for a while, and the whole thing could have been avoided just with screening of the mail to that level. So these incidents are obviously the kind of thing we try to avoid. But again, just to highlight some of the different avenues, different methods, that was white powder, and these examples are threatening letters. Some of these were delivered anonymously, some of them were just mailed typical regular mail. But again, you've got a news crew outside. And the threatening letters, and I think Cody will elaborate on this at some point later on in our presentation today. Threatening letters can indicate an escalating threat level, right? As it starts with a handwritten note and it moves into something beyond that. And so we're seeing some of these examples. Suspicious packages obviously would be with the amount of deliveries that are coming through Amazon. There's a lot of organizations that are allowing employees to to receive personal deliveries at the office. So you're kind of opening up some risk there. So again, Fred, Thomas, and Cody will take us through some of these examples and what we can do about them, but just to highlight a few of those up front. So what I'd like to do now for the next few slides, let's bring in Thomas Geppert. Thomas, can you talk to us about what is leading to the increase in this threat and what is the state of the world as Fred has kind of teed us up on that? Can you take us through what you're seeing there for societal pressures and things along those lines?
Yes, sure. First of all, I want to thank you for being on this webinar. I'm looking into it from a European perspective a little bit. I'm sitting at the moment in Germany with the beautiful weather outside. As you said before in your introduction, I was responsible 16 years for the corporate security of Deutsche Börse Group. That means the stock exchange. Deutsche Börse Group was one of the third biggest stock exchanges in the world. I looked over more than 9,000 employees and their physical security in more than 50 locations. So I know a little bit what we're talking about here due to different threat situations in various countries. What is leading to that increase of threat? If we look on the economy side of it, at the moment, there's a large scale of recession everywhere in the world. The inflation rate is going crazy. We have 6.9% in Germany, and as far as I read, the latest number was 7.7% in the US in 22. That's what they think the final number will be. People are afraid of war, especially in Europe. If we look at Ukraine and Russia situation at the moment, it's happening in Europe, and it's just next door for us, especially for us in Germany. There's just one country in between, and it's difficult. People are afraid of shortages, food, oil, gas, everything we were relying on from the Russian side. We have a massive price increase in all these. You as well in the US realize that the fuel prices go through the roof. And we have mortgage foreclosures. So from the economic side, it is a lot of pressure to the people, and this leads to threats. There's also frustration in jobs. There's consumers are angry on executives, on the world, on COVID and being home for 2 years and lockdowns. All that comes together, and this leads into more and more threat situations for companies and for threat for the executives and for each and every employee in this company. If I look into the different threats or the different factors that are contributing to threats, companies more and more reducing their budgets, they're cutting their budgets on the physical security side. I realized that in my old company, physical security was not on the first spot of the list, I would say. Insider threats were not on the first list, on the first points. It was very difficult to go through all this. The C-level prioritized always the cyber threats over the physical security threats. Shareholder value was the most important part, and so we did everything to keep the shareholders happy, and we left out the threat situations in the world a little bit. So if we look at the insider, especially insider threat, they're diverted in three different positions, I would say. It's the negligent person, it's a criminal, or it's fraud. And these three reasons why insiders, or not why insider, these three points are leading to an insider threat. And the insider threat over the last couple of years raised about 5% every year. So there are more and more companies hit by insiders. And one point is also, from the insider threat perspective, is vandalism. People are just not happy and they vandalize in the companies. They leave the water tap open and they cause a little bit of flooding just to punish the company for being angry or sad. You spoke about mail and the intercompany mail. This is also a big threat situation we considered in the stock exchange at that point. But also in various offices we had no chances to look into these and scan these. Most of the big offices, we had all the devices, but that was cut down because the sea level said nothing happens. So they cut it down and didn't think about all these threats we see as professionals in the physical security side. I think I can take over to the next person.
Yeah. So thank you, Thomas. So what I'd like to do, we talked about emerging threats and obviously some of the examples you're giving us here. If you advance to the next slide, we have a few, examples of the evolution of styles of threat. Thomas, I understand you have some experience, likely from the stock exchange and other sources, with those evolving threats and types of threat. Clearly, we're here mostly to talk about the warshipping and Phygital that's on the bottom there. But these things are sort of all connected. So take us through, if you would, on some experiences you've had with different types of threat here and how they might evolve over time.
Yes, in the time I was working for the stock exchange, we were lucky that we didn't receive a real IED, but we were looking for it. We had hoax IEDs, like models or not real ones, just to keep us busy, I would say. Another thing we did not expect, or we did not have, were robberies, because the stock exchange doesn't really have a physical value on the trading floor. So that wasn't things we had a lot, but insider attacks, vandalism, these things happened on a regular basis. And also cyber attacks. We have a huge department which deals with all the cyber attacks, and that was one major concern of the sea level. If we look into warshipping and Phygital attacks, it was always considered by me and my colleagues that this is one big threat. If you send a package with an incendiary agent into a data center, it is a big, big risk. Usually, if we look into the data centers, or if I looked into the data centers in the world, usually they don't have scanning devices. It is enough if the package is announced and it's signed off. So an insider could easily prepare a device which goes into one of the racks and starts it remote and lights a fire. So this is one big, big point of threat in this situation here.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so to dive a little deeper into the convergence of physical and cyber, like you're describing there, Thomas, Cody, I'd like to bring you in and take us to the next few here and some examples of what you're seeing and what folks can be on the lookout for. So I'll kick us over to the next one. So also, Fred and Thomas, please feel free to dive in as we move into more of a conversation style here. But Cody, could you take the lead and take us through the next few?
Yeah, thanks, TJ, and thanks everyone for joining today. I guess let's just jump in real quick and talk about this warshipping or Phygital threat that we've been alluding to. And I think it was like 39% had little knowledge of what this is and what's going on. So basically, we are talking about the convergence of the two, of a physical and a digital threat that's being introduced into your organization to cause any number of disruptions, to steal information, et cetera. These things became kind of popular for a little bit in 2019 at Black Hat USA when this was kind of introduced as a whole. However, these things are, I would say, they're super easy to construct. They're cheap. The information is readily accessible on YouTube. One of our technical team members recently put one together for $200 off of Amazon, and 20 minutes, and it was functioning and ready to go. And it can be stuffed into a box and sent on. If you want to shop around a little, you can do it for less than $100, right? If you're a little more enthusiastic. If a lazy, as my teammate coined the term, a lazy hacker, you're going to throw this into a box, and that's something that could easily be detected via technology. And that's something that we could actively see pretty easy because it doesn't fit the norm. If they have a little bit more ambition, and they hide these digital threats inside, some sort of like a toner cartridge or something that has, enough components in there to make you kind of think, okay, this looks right. Then we've got a bigger concern there. But this is kind of the threat that we're looking at. They're super easy to construct. They're easy to conceal. They can be sent in, bypass your layered security, introduced right into your organization, and then here we're dealing with this problem, right? And this is what we're talking about. Traditional cyber attacks, we're used to those. We have robust procedures in place that we back up our data, we secure our devices and networks, we use encryption and firewalls and multi-factor authentication and all of these things. But with worshipping, these devices can bypass a lot of features that we typically aren't thinking about when it comes to how physical items are introduced into an organization, right, through the front door. We call it coming in the back door, which is typically the loading dock or the mail room. So when they're able to bypass these security layers, it increases our exposure, and we have to be sure that we have proper things in place to mitigate those threats. So the thing about worshipping that I kind of want to highlight is it removes the human element of someone having to physically access your network or plug in a USB drive or something of that nature, right? Once this device is on site, they can either passively or actively attempt to attack your wireless access or your network. And they sit there and they're working, and we have no idea that these things or occurring. I often think, and maybe Fred and Thomas can and elaborate on this a little bit, but I like to think of it in simpler terms. What if somebody introduces one of these devices and they are simply monitoring conversations, sensitive conversations, without even getting into the network? Someone delivers through a private courier a bouquet and a talking teddy bear, but inside it's been replaced with one of these devices that has an internal power source. It gets delivered, it's sitting in there, and it's monitoring audio. And again, maybe Fred and Thomas can kind of annotate some of the important conversations that go on that this could potentially be a threat to.
Sure, Cody, I'd be happy to jump in. This is Fred talking. As you were giving this presentation, which I must say is a tad bit frightening, look, I've been in this business since 1981. And when you start looking at protection strategies from a holistic perspective, the one lesson we learned the hard way over time is that the threat actor, regardless of all your physical security that you might have in place and all the countermeasures you have, they're always out there looking for ways to defeat certain kinds of systems. So this very novel approach of the introduction of these kinds of devices are extraordinarily difficult, I think, especially for my generation of security practitioners that are going to look at this from the standpoint of, well, heck, we're used to the mailing of package bombs or IEDs or screening for your traditional kinds of threats. Having said that, we've crossed into this new spectrum where, from a counterintelligence perspective, not only can these be introduced from an outside threat actor, but also from the insider, where that kind of damage could be done for a long period of time if you're able to secrete one of these devices inside of that corporate headquarters, which certainly begs for the very strong TSCM countermeasures that folks like us might want to rethink for not only how you go about screening, but how you go about looking for these. I'd love to know Thomas's view on this from the European aspect as to what he's seeing with this from the potential protective intelligence concern.
Yes, thank you. To be honest, TSCM is one of the big concerns from guys like me, but the C-level never thinks about that. They said, there's no need, everything is public, and we don't have any secrets, we don't have to worry about. And I said, no, we have a lot of secrets. For example, mergers, which might coming up, first discussions about mergers and acquisitions could destroy the whole deal if this comes public beforehand. And in Germany, I would say only a handful companies are available to do decent sweeps and TSCM measures at all. And the European, I can't speak for the European side, I just can speak for the German side. The German side is not very much interested in TSCM, to be honest.
You know, Thomas, you struck a chord when you said this, and I can't tell you the number of Fortune 100 CEOs who have that I've talked to and helped over the years. Well, they'll say, "Well, you know, what threats exist directed towards me?" And I think they forget that not only depending upon the sector that they're in, that there's huge foreign counterintelligence, hostile nation state interest in what you do. You know, you employ thousands of employees around the globe in certain areas, and just from an intellectual property perspective, to your point, you know, your business plans, your internal intellectual property is of interest to at least a half a dozen hostile intelligence agencies that I think all of us could name here on the webinar. And so from that perspective, the other interesting dynamic is when I've had this conversation with some is that, you know, some of the world's largest CEOs will say, well, I've got a company that really protects that aspect of the business. I'm really kind of worried about the family. You know, I want to make sure that none of these kinds of devices get into my home or into my vacation home or into my private jet or into my Porsche.
Into the vehicle. That's a big point, because all the conversations usually they take place in the vehicle.
Without a doubt, that's the first place you're going to want to target if you're trying to collect intelligence on a CEO or anybody that you're really looking for from an intelligence collection perspective.
Yeah. So, guys, this is all excellent information. What I'd like to do is bring Cody back in a bit here to talk us through, now that, you know, we're laying out the foundation of, you know, the situation we're all up against. But, Cody, can you walk us through some of the things that we recommend implementing? And as we go through this, we will, again, you know, add some more conversation and kind of back and forth here. But so, Cody, if you would dive in on this one so we can, you know, talk about what to do about this problem as we move along here.
Sure. Yeah. I think one of the things that we really focus a lot on, and it may be relevant for this audience, is the ability to scale the mail security solution or whatever you're implementing. And if we're talking about, say, the financial industries in particular, oftentimes we're looking at a global footprint with multiple locations, varying sites with varying risks that they're exposed to. And, you know, the risk determines the solution, and that's one of the things that we're always looking at. And I think where the mistake is often made is that some of the sites that we may consider low risk or they're way down on the totem pole can often have some exposure that we may be unaware of. And this has been highlighted recently with a client I was working with, and again, large organization, large footprint. And some of their C-suite team members float around from office to office. They have very high security standards at a lot of locations. However, some of the sites that these individuals visit have lower standards when it comes to physical security, in particular mail security. And mail often piles up and waits on them until they show up on site on whatever cycle that is, and then they obtain whatever's there and they continue on with their business. You know, that's an example of something that we see is a major threat, specifically if it comes to a low-risk site that may not have technology screening. And then you have a Phygital threat, a warshipping device that may be introduced, and it's sitting there for weeks or months on end while it's doing damage or collecting data, or until the battery runs dead, et cetera. So that's something that we want to make sure that we assess all of our sites extremely carefully. And, you know, ideally the technology and the processes that we put in place should be streamlined into the system that we're building that allows us to have this continuity and familiarity across our entire organization. they may not all be done exactly the same, but we want to have that building block approach that builds this continuity across the whole system that people can work within that familiar work environment. One of the things that we hit on, and just real quick, when we're talking about understanding the mail threat risk, that's a big part of what we do, and it's critical, and it can oftentimes be somewhat overwhelming, especially for people who aren't familiar with mail security or mail threats in general. And by nature, humans, we like to overcomplicate things, right? So to simplify this process, we're basically just looking at the potential threats that we may be exposed to. We're looking at how vulnerable we are to these threats. And then we're going to look at the consequences of these threats materializing. What would that look like in the organization? Is it a threat to family members, like was alluded to earlier? Is it a business continuity thing? Is it a brand, an attack on the brand that will cause maybe some downstream effects that we're kind of unaware of, or we don't really know how those are going to play out? So these are things that we want to look at within, kind of that microscope or that magnifying glass type approach. And keep in mind, as these new threats emerge and evolve, we have to respond to these things in real time. We can't wait until that scheduled review that's 9 months from now, right? If something's happening and it's hitting in the news, especially with the mail and a lot of other threats, really, we see copycats. So we want to be able to respond in real time to a lot of these threats to make sure that we understand what this risk, the risk is, and that we have certain procedures in place to mitigate those. When we're talking about mail screening needs, one of the easiest things people can do if they're unfamiliar with it is kind of refer to the DHS or the Homeland Security best practices. And you can see on here, and I don't have to go through all this, but there are 12 different industries that have been highlighted as high risk. Yeah, I would say if you fall under the umbrella of any of these industries, however loosely you may think it is, you can see the best practices listed in the matrix at the bottom. You need to be screening for a host of different threats that you may be exposed to. It seems like a lot, but a lot of the things that you can implement and that we help people implement, you can knock out several of these by doing certain things, right? So it's not like each individual one has a particular process. At a minimum, if you consider yourself low risk or have low exposure, there are basic things like visual screening, looking for dangerous contraband, things like that hoax devices are a big problem. We need to be looking out for those. So there's basic things, even your lowest risk sites need to be looking for. And that's a starting point to get you going. And then you're going to build upon that as you kind of build these programs out and start looking at the different things that need to be addressed. We advocate the 5 pillars of mail security, of effective mail security. And when you're building a program, we think that you need to have components, these 5 components kind of implemented equally, or at least to the level that they need to be in order for you to be effective. If you're missing one of these, you're going to have problems in one aspect or another, or the other areas are going to struggle a little bit, right? So oftentimes as we're working through each of these pillars, we can it'll help us identify the strengths and weaknesses of the program. And that really gives you a good baseline to see where you're at and where you need to go. And then you can craft kind of this holistic approach that best addresses the problems that you are specifically dealing with. And that's one of the things I want to highlight too, is mail security is not a cookie cutter response. Every organization has a lot of particulars that are unique to them, and it has to be looked at through that lens. Talking about people is that people are the #1 pillar you kind of see on here. And, there's some information here on the slide, but based what I would like to say on this is that, most of the mail threats that we see are motivated by someone within or close to the organization often. And, we have to put effort into mitigating those. We've talked about insider threats quite a bit today. I would add in, just something that I've been seeing a lot lately is the use of inter-office mail and how vulnerable that is for insiders to do some damage to the organization or to the system, because it often bypasses screening measures and screening protocols. We consider it safe. It gets dropped in a box. It goes on its way. It's never looked at. That is an area that can use a lot of work kind of across the board, and something we've been helping people with a lot lately. If you're about to have layoffs, which, looking at recent numbers and seeing what's coming across a lot of the news cycles, there's a lot of companies that are tightening up. And if that is going on, and we have an idea that this is going on, right, we need to prepare for incidents related to that. So we have to anticipate and monitor these events that may have impacts on our organization. And we have to respond in real time. Again, we can't wait. We have to respond in real time to try to mitigate these the best that we can. People are really good at noticing change, and especially when it comes to these insider threats. Your employees, the people that you work with, people that are around you, may notice the demeanor changes, the characteristics that folks often give off when they are engaging in nefarious activities, if you want to put it that way, right? So we want to prevent the people risk. We want to use people to the best of our ability. We also want to make sure the people that we have in these mail screening roles are kind of empowered and bought into the system that we have in place to make sure that we're good to go in those areas. SOPs. This is a big one that I spend a lot of time on. And, these processes and procedures, if you do not have them in place for your program, your mail security or mail screening program, you need to work on that, right? If it's an outdated plan or document, if it's something you borrowed from someone else and it's not unique to you, you need to be working on that. They are critical in dealing with these mail-borne threats, and especially these Phygital threats that we're referencing here today. They help set up these policies and standards and training and our screening processes and have these guidelines built in on how to deal with these suspicious items. Things like not letting packages sit around prior to screening, discarding waste or packaging material as soon as you can to kind of mitigate things from sitting around and potentially exposing yourself to these threats. Those are just some of the things that that need to be built into these to make sure people know and to help guide them in making the right decisions on this type of stuff. Are your SOPs based on government guidelines? There are some government guidelines that'll kind of help you get a really loose, generic plan in place. That's a good start, but you really need to do a lot more than that to have something that's really robust. Do your SOPs fit your specific facilities and all of your locations? Do you have a way to measure risk that allows you to craft this proper response? Are you reviewing these regularly and maintaining these standards regardless of whatever the location or situation you're looking at? And these are some of the important concepts that we really try to build into some of these SOP solutions. When we're talking about all of this stuff, hopefully it never happens, but if it does culminate in an emergency and an emergency response is warranted in a worst case scenario, you need to plan for the type of response that you want to have. And I often tell people that, and they kind of shake their head and they're wondering, that doesn't make any sense. Well, throughout my career, I responded to a lot of incidents that were that could have had much less impact. We're talking government, private sector, et cetera. The impact would have been much, much smaller if they'd had basic plans put into place. Not everything warrants calling 911 and having a full call out with hazmat and fire and police and EMS. Not every incident requires that, right? Some incidents, if you have the time and you made that call, you could maybe notify, EOD Secure through RaySecur, or maybe you have a local postal inspection service office that you can contact. They'll have a DMI inspector come out, screen the item, very low key, can give you the same results, right? And then much less of an impact organizationally, and as far as a brand or outside, media picking up on it, et cetera. So those are some things that you can work through if you have these plans in place. And really, the thing to really highlight is these documents mandate how the threat is managed. And they also kind of guide the actions of everyone involved. So, we want to prepare those and we want to rehearse those often to make sure folks really know what they need to do. So if you do all these things, I'm kind of running through these for the sake of time, but once you work through this process, once you build this program out, once you get the people and the technology and the procedures and stuff in place, then you're going to be able to close this gap that we talk about, which is this mail security gap. We want to identify the problems. We want to understand the risk and likely threats that we may be exposed to. We want to implement this holistic solution that we talked about, the 5 pillars of mail security. We want to make sure we're using the right tools, and we want to make sure we're adhering to validated standards. And I think once we do that, we can really close this gap and kind of, when we're looking at a physical security as a whole, that's often what's left over and overlooked, and you can really strengthen your program if you're able to do these things.
Excellent. Well, thank you, Cody. And as you mentioned, for interest of time, what we're going to do is jump into our Q&A. So before we do that, this is just a few highlights of the additional resources that RaySecur has provided today. I know that ASIS attendees can see all those. Would love to have you check those out. We have plenty more on our website, RaySecur.com, if this is of interest. So, of course, get in touch with us, and we're happy to chat through all those things if you like. So what I'd like to do is open up to questions for the group. So, gentlemen, we'll just kind of do this round robin style. And again, it's not too late, folks, to get questions in. If you've got them, please drop them into the Q&A box here. So, guys, the first question that I've got on the list here is, it says companies tend to go high tech, thinking the tech is sufficient to repel security threats. What's the best advice to be more balanced in our approach to balance physical and digital security and produce a working security system? So, Fred, let's start with you on that. How can we balance physical and cyber through all the the issues we've talked through today?
Well, first, it's a great question. You have to look at it from a holistic approach, and I do get that question a lot at the center, and it's surfaced before in some of our CSO roundtables. It's important to build bridges between legal, HR, facilities, whoever else you have to work with in order to bring them on board. And process-wise, what I have found is that it doesn't necessarily have to be some rigid process that you try to create. It can be done informally with just roundtables to kind of start the ball rolling, because what we still see is a lot of siloed data. For example, HR not telling security what's going on. Not too long ago, I gave a keynote speech at one of the largest HR conferences out in Vegas, and I was surprised just to hear the number of HR reps in the audience that still today were reluctant at times to bring security in the loop when they were doing something as simple as a problematic termination. So I think we still have a long way to go to break down these informational silos. So I think we should be the ones taking the initiative in the corporate security space to reaching out to making sure that we all have visibility into the different silos that exist inside the company.
Thomas or Cody, anything to add on that?
No, I'll just kind of reiterate, that's an excellent point, Fred. And using the HR example, I saw lots of that in my career where employees were terminated or had bad departures, and the corporate security had no idea it was going on. And then the next thing you know, they have an incident that maybe could have been, if not prevented, it could have been at least minimized. And I think that's an excellent point where everybody has to be on board. And that's not a tech solution, that's a people solution. And I think that's important to distinguish.
Yeah, I think so too. The information flow is the most important thing here. You need to speak to every person who is involved in these kind of things. It's facilities, it's HR, and so on. You're absolutely right.
And there's a question here that might be some sort of related to that. The question is, what steps can an organization take to increase awareness of mail security? And I take that to be somewhat related, where security obviously knows about mail being a threat avenue. Is it possible that HR and other departments don't consider mail a threat? So perhaps along those lines, what could we either mail and facilities organizations or the security department be doing to help increase awareness and improve folks' understanding of this issue internally, and I suppose possibly externally as well? So Fred, again, we'll start with you. How can we raise awareness of this issue inside of organizations?
Well, I think it's an outstanding question. look, I was working with a company once that had a hoax device inside the corporation that was left in the break room. And the next thing you know, the entire sales team is evacuated. The police are responding. News crews are showing up. The ramifications to a mail-related incident inside the company is something that, unless you've personally experienced, you have no idea as to the chaos that it causes, to the point that the CEO now is asking questions as to how the heck did this happen. So I think it begins with awareness. I think it begins with security outreach programs. I know some of the Fortune 1000s that we work with, they routinely push out different guidance on a range of different topics to include little short videos. I know one high-tech company that the most downloaded video inside the entire company is on workplace violence and active shooters. So something like that could certainly be done internally, just from an awareness perspective, because it's been my experience in the security space that people really want to know how they are secure in the office and what should they do if they get that suspicious white powder letter on their desk. So it's incumbent upon us in the security space to take the initiative and get these kinds of awareness programs up and running.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Thomas, what are you seeing, in Germany, and if you have contacts in the rest of Europe that talk about this issue? Is there any difference in what you're hearing from Fred and our kind of U.S.-centric discussion so far that you might add to this, from what Europe has to say?
No, I think the main points were said, and we're dealing with the same stuff in Europe as well. The only difference is that the workplace violence is not that common, and if workplace violence takes place, it's not taking place as a single shooter or an active shooter event because of our strict gun laws in Europe.
Mm-hmm. Cody, there's a question here about centralizing mail delivery for an organization, and you can go so far as digitizing. And with an eye on the clock and respect folks' time, what can you tell us about digitizing mail to try to prevent any of these threats? And have you seen that work? Have you seen that rolled out before?
Yeah, that's definitely if you want to isolate mail screening in the mail from, say, your standard physical location of your organization, and you have an offsite facility that's doing that, that's the ultimate option. If you have the funds and the space to remove that physically from people, to screen everything, to open it up, to scan stuff in, and then let people receive a digital copy of that, your exposure is greatly reduced. So yes, that's in the perfect world, that is what we would like to do. Unfortunately, most organizations do not have the facility space or the budget oftentimes to really put that much toward just the mail. And again, talking earlier, a lot of times they see it as a threat that's not really warranted, or something that's not really warranted. Complacency creeps in, and I think that goes back to kind of what Fred and Thomas were talking about. I think we need to be educating people on emerging threats as they come out, and I'm talking about the workforce as a whole, all of our folks, so they know these things are relevant. They are occurring all around us. If we don't do that, they're never going to hear about it, and it's just something that happens once every few years. So we want to make sure they know, hey, these things are happening daily, and we don't want to bombard them daily, but maybe just a wrap up, ever so often. It kind of keeps it at the top of their head. Yeah.
Excellent. All right. Well, thank you, Cody. And gentlemen, thank you for joining us. I believe this takes us to the end of our time. So Thomas, Fred, Cody, thank you so much for your panel today.